You have inside you a library of rules you didn't write. They came to you masked as advice, rituals, prayers, polite corrections, performance reviews, and casual remarks at dinner tables. They arrived as shoulds and musts and gradually became less like foreign voices and more like your own conscience. Nietzsche called this the ascendance of the bad conscience, the inward policing of the self that turns impulses into debts and instincts into sins. But what if that internal law is not yours at all? What if it is the herd's way of surviving by making you small? This is not moralizing, it is diagnosis. Nietzsche's genealogy of morals shows that guilt and ought emerged as instruments of debt and domination ways communities bound individuals to collective survival strategies. The modern miracle is that these external controls migrated inward and now operate as the bad conscience. You do not need someone to shout orders at you anymore. You preemptively conform, policing yourself to avoid the internalized shame that would otherwise follow a transgression. The paradox is brutal. Obedience becomes efficient. It costs the herd nothing to have every member submit voluntarily. So where does this leave ambition? For many ambitious people, wanting more feels like a moral transgression. Ask yourself, when you consider asking for higher pay, taking credit, or pursuing that risky project, what whisper arises? Is it the cool, measured voice of a considered judgment? Or the thin tisk of someone who thinks you'll become arrogant, greedy, or unloving? That whisper is often slave morality in disguise. It equates striving with selfishness because ressentiment, the reactive envy of the powerless, has written a moral script where desire is suspect. Nietzsche saw this. The herd's morality turns strength into guilt and excellence into a sin to be denied. The result is success, guilt, and people-pleasing, the twin shackles that keep capable people small. But Nietzsche doesn't leave you in condemnation. He hands you tools. The will to power, misunderstood as mere domination, is actually the engine of self-overcoming. It is not the desire to crush others. It is the drive to realize, expand, and create one's capacities. Becoming who you are requires diagnosing which of your rules increase your life and which diminish it. The genealogical method teaches you to trace every should back to its origin. Who benefits from this rule? Where did it come from? Does it enhance your capacity to act, create, and love? Or does it preserve a social equilibrium at your expense? Begin small and clinical. Write down the rules you live by, the ones that stop you from asking for the raise, that keep you saying yes to extra work, that make you apologize when you deserve to state your needs. Next to each, write its origin story. Did your parents say it? Did a teacher? A doctrine? A company cultural meme? Or a neighborhood rumor plant it? Often you will find the rule was not forged in your flourishing, but in someone else's fear. Once you see the architecture of your obedience, guilt loses some of its authority. It becomes traceable, contextual, contingent. It stops being a verdict and starts being a historical artifact. But diagnosis is only the first move. Nietzsche insists on revaluation, not merely rejecting the old values, but creating new ones. That is the work of the Übermensch in miniature, not an exotic elite, but a farmer of values in your own life. Ask, what values would produce more life, not less? Which principles would amplify your capacity rather than shrink it? Honesty that increases intimacy, courage that expands opportunity, discipline that enables creation. These are possible master morality decisions. They are not immune to ethical reflection. Nietzsche's point is radical, not reckless. Create values that affirm life, not that toy with cruelty. Transforming guilt into fuel is practical, not mystical. Reframe guilt as information, a signal that a conflict exists between an internalized rule and a living desire. Use cognitive techniques to interrogate the guilt. Is it justified by harm, or is it rehearsed by social fear? If the guilt points to real harm, respond with corrective action. If it points only to the herd's discomfort, then learn to stand in the discomfort without capitulation. This is where self-compassion meets Nietzschean courage. The ancients of life affirmation did not tell you to ignore suffering. They told you to make suffering meaningful by using it to forge stronger capacities. Embodying your will to power also requires rituals of practice. Nietzsche admired the athlete and the artist for the disciplined habit of working toward excellence. Adopt daily rituals that concretize new values. A short journal entry each morning asking, "What did I choose today because it increased my power to create?" Practice saying no in private, then in low-stakes social settings, then in larger arenas. Negotiate once under the rubric of your new values and observe the physiological change when you align action with authorship. Each micro-victory dissolves a thread of the bad conscience, not by argument alone, but by habit and nerve. Expect social backlash, because revaluation threatens the herd's equilibrium. When you stop following other people's rules, the first response is often resentment disguised as concern. Loved ones may accuse you of selfishness. Colleagues may ostracize you with silence. Peers may shrink you with jokes. Nietzsche knew this well. Creating values often requires solitude. Yet solitude should not be romanticized as mere isolation. It is the workshop of becoming. Use it to refine your aesthetic and ethical standards. Seek selective alliances, communities that practice intensity rather than comfort, peers who admire creativity, mentors who model revaluation. These are not tactics for manipulation. They are ecosystems for growth. Now consider the ultimate test Nietzsche offered, the thought experiment of eternal recurrence. Imagine living this life, with all its choices, repeatedly for all eternity. Would you affirm the life where you habitually obeyed other people's rules, or the life where you refused those rules in order to create your own? The experiment does not terrorize you into perfection. It forces radical ownership. If the answer tilts toward the latter, you have the moral courage demanded by becoming who you are. Do not mistake this for permission to dominate others. Nietzsche's ideal is not cruelty, it is creative flourishing. Authentic power increases life, yours and those around you. It is generous in the tough sense. It gives the gift of example rather than the tax of manipulation. When you act from self-created values, you invite others to rethink. You do not coerce their weakness into compliance. Finally, practice an ethic of testing. New values must be tested against consequences, not declared in rhetorical zeal. Try a value for a month. Measure its effects on your capacity, relationships, and joy. If it produces brittle pride, discard it. If it produces resilience and creation, refine it. This iterative practice protects against two pitfalls: the relapse into people-pleasing and the slide into a vanity of power. To stop following other people's rules is not a call to chaos. It is an invitation to authorship. Nietzsche's work is the manual of diagnosis, not a dictatorial prescription. It tells you where the shackles hide, why they were forged, and how to melt and reforge their metal into tools. The reward is simple and formidable: a life where your musts are written in your hand and where ambition is no longer a source of shame, but the expression of a cultivated self. This is not an abstract ideal. It is a practice. Begin with one rule: trace its genealogy, test its life, create a replacement, live it, and then repeat. In that repetition, you will find that the voice of obligation quiets and the voice of authorship grows louder, until at last you no longer ask permission to be large. There is a soft violence in the life of obedience. You comply not because someone forces you, but because a voice inside has already learned to punish you for disobedience. Nietzsche called this the bad conscience, the inward shift of external coercion into an internal jailer. What we call following the rules is often the result of a genealogy of prohibitions and compensations that long ago solved a social problem by teaching individuals to police themselves. The problem is that those solutions persist long after the problem has died, and the rules that preserved a tribe's survival now preserve your smallness. To understand this without flattering your resentments, look through Nietzsche's two lenses, master morality and slave morality. Master morality is an origin story of positive valuation. The strong judge what increases life and call it good. Slave morality, born in ressentiment, inverts the noble's values into virtues of humility, pity, obedience. The proud man's "I create values" becomes, in the reactive imagination of the weak, a story of oppression, and thus the weak celebrate meekness. The effect is not merely philosophical, it is psychological. When your environment teaches that ambition equals selfishness, you internalize an ethic that makes your flourishing suspect. You become vigilant for the slightest trace of pride and preemptively atone. The result is success, guilt, the chronic shrinking that keeps you from claiming your due. But Nietzsche does not announce despair. He offers method. The genealogical method is diagnostic. Ask not whether a rule exists, but how it came into being and whom it served. Trace the origin story of your musts. Was "you must always be modest" a family script handed down to maintain group cohesion when resources were limited? Was "do not outshine the elders" a social survival tactic during scarcity? Modern psychology will tell you the same. Many shoulds are learned safety behaviors, people-pleasing, avoidance, deferment stamped into neural pathways by repeated reinforcement. The liberating move is to see the rule as strategic history rather than moral law. This shift in perspective turns guilt from a verdict into data. Guilt, properly interrogated, signals a conflict between an inherited rule and a living aim. The practical question becomes diagnostic. Does this rule increase my capacity to act, to create, to love? If not, it is not a higher moral truth. It is a fossilized survival trick. Here, the will to power must be clarified. Nietzsche's will to power is not raw domination. It is the creative drive to expand one's abilities, to craft forms of life that express one's nature. When you treat ambition as an engine of creation projects, mastery, relationships built on excellence, you transform selfishness into artistry. Move from diagnosis to experiment. Nietzsche's Übermensch is not a sermon delivered once. It is a continuous work of self-overcoming. Start with a genealogical audit. List 3 rules that stop you from acting, rules that trip you when you negotiate, when you claim credit, when you say no. For each rule, write its probable ancestor: a parent, a teacher, a creed, a corporate ritual. Then test each rule for function. Does obeying this rule produce outcomes you value? Does it increase your vitality and capacity? If yes, keep and refine. If no, design a provisional counterrule, a test value, and practice it as a laboratory hypothesis for 30 days. This makes ethics experimental rather than inherited. Expect social friction. Nietzsche knew the creator of values often stands beyond the herd and faces hostility. When you refuse others' rules, you will be tested. Friends may accuse you of selfishness. Colleagues may ostracize with silence. Family systems will pressure you subtly. Prepare scripts that preserve relationships without surrendering values. Articulate choices in terms of your aims rather than as attacks on theirs. I appreciate your concern. I'm choosing to allocate my time this way because it aligns with my responsibilities and goals. This is not manipulation. It is transparent self-possession. True mastery avoids deceit because deceit is brittle. Authentic power uses clarity, not coercion. A crucial guard against narcissistic misreading. Test every new value against two pressures. First, the cruelty test. Does this value produce harm to others as a byproduct of your flourishing? If so, refine it. Nietzsche's life-affirming stance is not a license for exploitation. It is a demand to create forms of life that enhance vitality broadly. Second, the humility test. Does this value produce gratitude and responsibility or merely self-aggrandizement? The Übermensch's creativity includes responsibility for consequences, a commitment to an inner court where your acts must pass scrutiny. These internal checks prevent becoming a new master of suffering. Use the thought experiment Nietzsche offered, eternal recurrence, as a crucible for your values. Imagine choosing to live your life with its choices and consequences again and again for eternity. Would you be proud to affirm the person who follows the old rules? Or the person who crafted their own rules to build, create, and love? This is not escapist spectacle. It is a blunt instrument of ownership. If your answer leans toward the second life, then your experiments are meaningful. If not, recalibrate. Integrate modern psychology into the Nietzschean practice. Cognitive reframing helps disentangle conditioned guilt. When the whisper says you are selfish for negotiating, respond with a factual counter. Negotiation is a professional skill that creates mutual value. Self-compassion steadies you when backlash arrives. Nietzsche did not admire weakness. He admired the capacity to face pain and transform it. Self-compassion is not indulgence, but the stability to take risks without collapsing into the old scripts. Boundary work, assertiveness training, and values clarification are Nietzschean in spirit because they produce internal sovereignty. Finally, remember the difference between being skillful at control and being unshakable. Machiavellian tactics teach you to influence outcomes by exploiting others' vulnerabilities. Nietzsche teaches you to be the source of your own norms, so you no longer need manipulation to succeed. The competitive advantage in life and leadership is not the ability to bend others. It is the capacity to stand in your created values and act from them with generosity and strength. This produces durable influence. People follow those who embody something new and life-enhancing, not those who merely game a system. To stop following other people's rules is to begin an apprenticeship in authorship. It is slow and often lonely work, but it yields a profound prize. Your decisions become your handwriting. Keep the tools: the genealogical audit, the experimental counter-rule, the daily ritual, the scripts for backlash, the eternal recurrence test, and the moral filters against cruelty and vanity. Use them not to become a tyrant, but to become a craftsman of your life. Nietzsche's insistence that man is something to be overcome is not an insult, it is an invitation. Overcome the inherited commands that make you small and forge a life whose rules you can defend in public and whose burdens you can love in private. You have learned the diagnosis. Your obedience is often an inherited program, a bad conscience that polices desire. Now comes the crucial question: what does living differently look like day to day when you stop following other people's rules? Nietzsche's philosophy is not an abstract invitation to rebellion. It's a practical toolkit for creating a life that answers your will to power. The final act is application. How to identify, test, and embody new values so that your life ceases to be a series of permissions and becomes a work you author. Start with a concrete test: the rule audit. Pick 5 rules that govern major parts of your life: work, money, relationships, time, speech. These are not platitudes, but operative commands. Always say yes to your manager. Don't ask for more money. Be modest about success. Put others' needs before my own. Never discuss salary. For each rule, ask 3 genealogical questions. Who first said this to me? In what context? And what did it protect? Answers often reveal survival, logic, scarcity, shame, group cohesion, not eternal moral law. When you see a rule as a strategy designed for a particular environment, it loses sanctity and becomes a choice. Next, apply the function test. For each audited rule, observe for 2 weeks what happens when you obey and when you deliberately act against it in a small, safe way. Negotiate a small salary increase. Say no to one non-essential favor. Publish a short piece without asking permission. Record the outcomes and the internal sensations. Does obeying increase your capacity to create value, sustain relationships honestly, and approximate your aims? Or does it produce anxiety, stagnation, and self-erasure? Nietzsche insists on experience as judge. The life-affirming rule enhances vitality. The life-denying rule curtails it. Transformation requires ritual. Nietzsche admired artists and athletes because they shaped themselves through repeated, disciplined acts. Design micro-rituals that instantiate your new values. A morning entry. A sentence of intention that names the value you choose to practice that day. Today I practice authorship by initiating rather than waiting. A midweek boundary rehearsal. A 30-minute slot where you decline all external demands and progress a personal project. A monthly courage act. Make a public choice aligned with your values, however small a talk, an ask, a refusal, and document the consequences. Ritual turns moral experiments into habit, and habit into character. When guilt surfaces, treat it as data, not doom. Nietzsche taught that guilt often masks historical debts and reactive ressentiment. Modern therapy calls it cognitive noise. Ask, does this guilt signal actual harm done to another person? Or does it sound like the old tape that equates ambition with theft? If the former, repair. If the latter, reframe. Use a short cognitive script. This guilt is conditioned. I will test the principle. If my action increases my ability to contribute and does not injure others, I will accept the cost of social discomfort. Repeat until discomfort reduces. This is self-compassion married to philosophical courage. Expect costs. Saying no, taking a stand, refusing the herd's language of duty will provoke pushback. Nietzsche did not romanticize popularity. The creator of values must accept temporary solitude. But solitude is not exile. It is the workshop for creation. Build a selective tribe. Peers who value growth over comfort. Mentors who tolerate risk. Friends who can disagree without weaponizing your choices. Replace the diffuse approval of the herd with focused covenants of respect. These alliances are strategic, protective ecosystems that amplify rather than diminish your will to power. Guard against 2 pitfalls, arrogance and cruelty. Nietzsche's ideal is life-affirming, not predatory. Test every adopted value against 2 criteria. Does it increase the capacity for flourishing broadly, not merely for your ego? And does it leave you accountable to consequences? A value that prizes excellence but dehumanizes others fails the test. Your power must be creative and integrative. If your new rules produce contempt, humiliation, or harm as their primary byproducts, you have mistaken domination for mastery. Use the eternal recurrence as your ethical stress test. Imagine living this life, with your new rules and choices forever. Are you willing to affirm it? This is not sentimental. It is brutal clarity. If the vision fills you with dread, adjust. If it fills you with a kind of stern rejoicing amor fati, then your values have resonance. Nietzsche did not offer consolation for vanity. He offered a measure of existential ownership. The eternal recurrence compels you to choose a life whose rules you can endorse without appeal to external validation. Economics is central. Nietzsche saw the spiritual dimming that accompanies material subjugation. If you follow other people's rules because of financial dependency, the first practical move is agency over resources. That may mean a side project, a learning sprint, a negotiation. Money is a vector for autonomy. Treating it as such is not greed. It is prerequisite infrastructure for value creation. Build financial options that permit you to live by your rules rather than deny them for survival. The work of self-overcoming must be anchored in practical leverage. Embodied practices accelerate change. Nietzsche was attuned to the body athletic rigor. Fasting, work the forms that shape character. Choose a bodily discipline that requires steady practice and honest feedback. Strength training, long-distance running, a martial art. The body is unforgiving. Progress requires measurable thresholds. Each training session is an analogy for moral training. Small efforts yield compound strength. When you feel soft under social pressures, the memory of physical rigor will remind you that difficulty is a path to capacity. Finally, cultivate an ethic of iteration. Nietzsche's Übermensch is not a final state. It is ongoing becoming. Adopt a quarterly revaluation process. Review the rules you created, the experiments you ran, the feedback you received. Iterate. Retire values that calcify into dogma. Celebrate the surprising results that expand life. This turns value creation into craftsmanship. You are not the product of a fixed moral architecture, but a sculptor continually refining a living form. The most profound advantage of this route is not tactical success, but internal sovereignty. The manipulator needs context to exploit. The authored person needs none. When your rules are yours, external approval becomes a luxury rather than a requirement. You act because you have reasons that survive solitude, and you are answerable to an inner tribunal grounded in integrity and responsibility. Nietzsche's radical freedom is not chaos, but disciplined authorship. So, begin the smallest impossible thing. Choose one rule to retire this week and one new rule to instantiate. Apply the genealogical test. Run the function test. Ritualize the tiny habit that makes the new rule visible. Expect resistance. Prepare scripts. Build physical discipline. Finance your options. Re-evaluate quarterly. If you do this, something remarkable happens. You will no longer be a borrower of values, but a lender. Your life will issue rules that help others flourish by example, not by command. That is Nietzsche's secret. True power is creative abundance, a generosity that confers possibility. Stop following other people's rules, not to prove them wrong, but to prove that you can create a life whose obligations you can love, whose burdens you can bear, and whose joy you would choose again and again.